awkward silence.
Wait a minute. Is anybody moderating this?
Yes, Brandon, you are.
Okay, I will take over. If you joke,
directions well.
If you joke, I will take over. Hi, welcome to the Writing Science Fiction Fantasy Series panel. If anyone else on here was asked to moderate and I'm taking from you, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to start with introductions and we'll start at that end and work our way down.
With me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Steve Stirling. I publish under SM Stirling because when I published my first book, they said, what name do we put on it? And I said, I'll just do it the way I signed the contract. And for several years, everyone assumed I was a woman because I was publishing under my initials. This was the 80s. I've written a number of series. The Island in the Sea of Time series, 3 books. The Change series, 15 books. The Black Chamber series, 4 and counting. And I've had a lot of luck.
Hi, my name is Peter David. How's that? This okay? Yeah, okay. My name is Peter David. I've had over 100 novels published. Thank you. In terms of series, I'm probably best known for the New Frontier series, which was the first original Star Trek series, which benefited greatly from Voyager because people bitched about Voyager and saying, wow, I really hate this series, and the literary Trek fans are going, well then you should read New Frontier, it's much better Star Trek. So, thanks. I've also written a number of shorter, less known series. I wrote a series for Ace Berkeley called the Sci-Fi books. I've written a series of novels. Each one is I don't know if we have to define whether a series is continued from one book to another or if each book is completely self-contained. Is that still a series?
That's later in the panel.
Okay, well, I've written 4 books in a series about a knight named Sir Apropos of Nothing. Yay! Or some fans call it Sir Apropos of Nothing, which drives me insane. And in terms of series, I've been also writing comic books for, 40 years.
So is this the right distance? Which is... There we go, okay. I'm Kevin J. Anderson and I have published 170 novels, so I can actually tell Peter David he's a slacker. I've written my own huge space opera called The Saga of Seven Suns, which had a couple of sequel trilogies and things. I've got an open-ended Dan Shamble zombie PI horror detective series. I've done a fantasy series called Spine of the Dragon, another one called Terra Incognita. I've written in some obscure media tie-ins for Star Wars. Let's see, and right now I'm spending a lot of my time working with Frank Herbert's son Brian, writing novels in the Dune universe.
Okay.
And I finish my series when I start writing them.
I finish other people's series when I start writing them. You pitched that one to me quite well. I'm Brandon Sanderson. I write epic fantasy.
I'm David Farland. I've written about half a dozen series, done Star Wars, Mummy, and my own Rune Lord series, along with The Mice of Magic, Golden Queen, a couple others.
I'm Kathryn Purdie, and if we're having a contest about how many books we've published, I've published 5. My debut series is called Burning Glass. It's a trilogy. I'm bringing it out. And my most popular series is Bonecryer's Moon and Bonecryer's Dawn. They're young adult fantasies. Do we have any other young adult authors? Or am I? Oh yes. We have the same illustrator, at least for our young adult books, Charlie. But whatever. Anyway, that's me. Oh, I haven't published 170. Are you the winner down there? 170? But I'm the #1 New York Times bestselling author. Thank you, ebook list for 1 week, New York Times.
Hi, I'm Melinda Snodgrass, and probably most of you know me because I wrote for Star Trek: The Next Generation. Episode called The Measure of a Man is the one that most people think of when they think of me. But I also write books and have been doing that for quite a long time. I do a space opera series, which is sort of, here's my Hollywood pitch, Bridgerton meets Star Wars. It's finished because I'm a screenwriter, so I plotted the last book before I ever began writing a 5-book series. I also used to be a lawyer before I got better. And I do another series called White Fang Law, which is about a young woman lawyer working in a vampire law firm in Manhattan. And then the other thing I do is I'm the co-creator and co-editor of a series called Wild Cards that I do with George R.R. Martin that we've been doing for way more years than I want to admit. We're up to 28 books, and I'm the executive producer developing it for television with Peacock. So that's what I've been up to.
Yeah, I bought my first Wild Cards novel from the same store that I bought Eye of the World from, back when I was a little baby boy, just discovering fantasy and science fiction. Yeah, they are cutting mics in between. I think it's because there's just so many mics up here, they're worried about interference. So, here's how I like to run panels, and I've been elected to be in charge of this, so we're going to do it my way. There are 7 panelists on here, if I count this correctly, which means that the chances we'll get to questions are very low. If we do, we will do them with the microphone in the center there, and I'll let you know when that's going to happen. We'll play it by ear. When I'll address a few questions to the panelists, and I make a different person go first each time. So actually, my next question will go to Peter first, and we'll go down, and then you'll get to get the last word. And then we'll go to Kevin. We'll just kind of work down this way. And you are giving first on this one. Yep. And so my first question is, this is actually, this is actually a question, Peter, that you kind of started to raise, which is the question of, do you view different type of series differently? And how does that change how you approach them? I'm talking about the series where they're all in the same world with different characters. The Tolkien style one where it's like, you know, we stop on the last page of one book and the next book just starts on the next day, continuing one big story. Or the same character, different adventures. How do you approach writing different types of series?
I prefer to do it the way I've been doing the apropos books, which I feel that when someone buys a book and they start at the beginning, there should be a middle and there should be an end. And if they get to the end of the book and they liked it and they want to read more about the character, then they can read the next book. If they didn't like it, they don't have to read the next book, and at least they got all the story. I mean, I understand why they do series that end in cliffhangers, but it drives me nuts. I mean, it just drives me completely insane. I feel, it's purely me. I think a series should have, each one should be self-contained. I mean, TV shows used to be that way, and then Hill Street Blues came along. And they would have storylines that would continue for 3 to 4 episodes. But on the other hand, in those same episodes, they did have completed storylines. So, they kind of tried to have it both ways, which I suppose is one way you can do a series. But I like having a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's just my preferences.
Kevin, what are your favorite types of series, and how do you differentiate them in your head?
There are different types. Because of, there we go, okay. Like when I'm doing my zombie detective series, it's like the TV show Castle. Every episode is a mystery, and it's got the same characters, and it continues, but you don't have to read all of them. But my Saga of 7 Sons, it's like The Expanse. It's 7 novels, it's one big story, and I'm sorry, Peter, every one of them ends on a cliffhanger. But the only reason I did that was because I knew that I was going to turn in the next book on time. And I knew that I could tell the reader who was pissed off at me that the next one was going to come out on time. And so I did 7 books. They all have cliffhangers except the end when everybody dies. But they came out and it was one giant story. Now, the third and last type, though, is all the Dune books that I've done. I think we've done 16 of them. But they're stories in specific trilogies. Here's a trilogy at this time period, a trilogy at this time period, so that you read the 3 books, beginning, middle, and end, and you're done if you want to stop, or you can read the next one, as opposed to you start one and you know you've got to read 16 books. That's a long haul to ask your audience to follow.
I like to have some sort of hybrid, kind of like Peter was talking about over there. One of my favorite ways to approach a series is try to make the first book stand really well on its own. So that it shows I can do a self-contained story in this world and approach, when I was pitching Mistborn to my editor, I said, I want to do in the first book what a lot of series take the entire series to do, and then leave people with the questions, well, what's he going to do next after that? And I've done this in several series where that first book is kind of like, it's like an application, or not an application, it's like a debut. It's like, read this and you'll find out what the series is about. And then the rest of them I'll let myself do cliffhangers on. And oftentimes you see a couple of 4-book series for this reason. The first book's kind of on its own, and then there's a trilogy that expands that and goes more in depth and whatnot. And I found that to be a very successful format.
Yeah, I like to have a series where it really is one long story arc, and it's really just a big book. I don't know why, but as a kid, I used to love to look at books, and I would gauge how much I would want to read them based on how fat they were. So I like to get involved in a story and get deep into world creation, and that's my favorite way to do it. On the other hand, I can see where if you've really got a fascinating character, something like a Sherlock Holmes or something like that, then episodic adventures might make perfect sense, particularly those old nickel novels that people were reading in the 1920s or 30s. They were just kind of right for, a quick airplane trip or something to do for an afternoon.
So basically, out of my 5 books, there's 2 series. The first is a trilogy, first-person point of view throughout the whole series. I did, that one, it wraps up nicely by the end of book 1, but I plotted it from the beginning as a trilogy and sold it as a trilogy. The second one is a duology. That one ended with a cliffhanger, has 3 points of view, same points of view per book, and pretty much picks up right where it leaves off. And I was gonna say, sometimes we, in our book deals, we're contracted for the whole series. I was under contract for a trilogy and a duology. I have lots of friends that are writing book 1 hoping it'll be a series, but they're only under contract for book 1. They don't know if their publisher's gonna pick up the rest. So if you're not published yet, I would strongly suggest that you write book 1 as if it could stand alone, but with series potential. I'm sure you've heard this kind of term before.
It's good advice. It worked for me, right? Like, I broke in part because when I was trying to break in, a lot of people were submitting book 1 of 12 as a brand new author, and the editors were rejecting those because, like, we don't know if this person can give us an ending. Right? And so that all of mine were standalones with series potential, and it is part of what sold me.
I come at this sort of with a screenwriter's attitude, which is the first thing I do is figure out what the final book is going to be. I love long, involved stories that carry characters through their events and how they change and grow. but I never start anything unless I know how it ends. So when I plotted the 5 books of the Imperial Saga, the first thing I did was figure out what the final book was going to be about and how it ended. And then I went forward and started laying it all out. Now, I'm at the point in my career where I didn't have to write the first book. I could write, 70 pages and then give a very detailed sort of Hollywood-style outline of how I was going to finish book 1 and then what book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5, and sold it that way. But I think if you are going into a series, sometimes it's appealing to say, well, I'm just going to have this open-ended thing. But I think readers can become tired of that and start to feel like they're being just used. When you buy another book, here's another book. And not to have a sense that they're going to have a satisfying journey that's going to have an ending that is emotionally powerful. For me, George and I fight about this all the time. He says that nobody cares about the ending if the journey is great. And I say, no, you will spoil the journey if the ending, flops. So you really do need to stick the landing. And Ty and Daniel, who do The Expanse, feel very strongly about that. And I know they had the final book of The Expanse worked out before, because I was in on some of those plotting sessions, before they ever sat down to write those books. So, I strongly urge you to think about what is important about this story. Why do you want to tell it? Why is it? What does this say about the human condition, the human heart and conflict in itself?
Okay, I might add that the reason the Lord of the Rings trilogy reads as if each book just picks up after this last sentence of the previous one is that Tolkien wrote it as one book. And the publisher made him split it up into 3 because it was so goddamn long. So you're actually reading one book if you go straight from the Fellowship through to the end. Kipling said there are 99 ways of construing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. It all depends how you work. I'm a pantser as far as plots go. I have a vague idea of where the plot's going to end up, and it almost always does end up there, but I'm really not certain about what's coming in between and how long it's going to be. Sometimes I think I'm going to finish the whole plot arc in one book, and it takes 3. Sometimes it's 1. I agree that if you're going to start a series and you're not the sort of person who they will drool on when you propose one, you should have a complete story arc in the first book. The series I'm working on now, which started with Black Chamber, started with 3 complete arcs in the first trilogy. Each one came to a conclusion. There was a problem, and the protagonists overcame it by the end of the book. They weren't dead, so there was something else for them to do, even if it was only die. The second trilogy in that series that I'm working on now is a single story arc covering 3 books. So, whatever works at any particular time. I'm a world-building completist, obsessive, maniac, fanatic. When I was writing my first book, I found myself crawling over a giant map the size of the living room I'd made out of pieces of paper, scotch taped together, and I was doing incredibly detailed notes on the trade routes for flax in 7th millennium post-apocalyptic North America, and I looked at it and said, Steve, is this going into the book? And I thought, no. And I thought, so stop this and get back to the typewriter. I actually wrote that book on a manual. See how long I've been writing. Yeah, so you have to control the things that you have a tendency to overdo and push the things that you have a tendency to underdo and do whatever works.
All right, Kevin, you're going to go first on this one. And maybe I should have started with this question. I'm curious what the panelists are going to say. Why do you write a series? What is it about a series that draws us to them? If you look at science fiction and fantasy, in particular, it is dominated by the series. Why do people love them? Why do you like writing them? Why do you think publishers like them? Any of the sorts of answers to any of those questions?
Well, I'm a natural well, I'm a natural novelist. I started out my career writing short stories, and I did okay with them, but I really started to shine when I started writing novels. And after I wrote novels, I really started to shine even more when I started writing like a multi-book series, because I like to tell a story that has 30 main characters and 20 storylines, and everything's all tangled up, and I love playing with that Rubik's Cube of the story. And when I'm plotting my things, I used to do them with index cards covering the whole floor with red cards and yellow cards and blue cards and rearranging them around so that it's this, to me, the character in a series is the story itself. It's this huge, intricate thing that I just love to start from the beginning. Like when I do a series, I mean, trilogies I kind of like the best because it's a beginning, middle, and an end. It's a big story, but it's controllable. I don't like to do series, and I don't think publishers like them, and I don't think you should try to write them as a writer, as I'm writing one book and, oh, that did well, so I will write 2 unnecessary books after it. I think if you're going to do a series, think of it as a series and build up the story, because there are so many times, like when I'm writing book 6, and I'm able to put in that zinger that I set up in book 1 that I knew about all along.
So I have a theory. I have theories on lots of things, but on this one I have an interesting theory. Sci-fi fantasy is set off by its world building, which increases the learning curve. A sci-fi fantasy book is in general harder to get into, requires more work. That work might be enjoyable. We like it. That's why we're here. That's why we write this. This is why we read this. But it also is effort. And people who are sci-fi fantasy fans tend to like being experts in things. This is just one of my theories. We like to tell people about our interests. We like to advocate for them. We like to be experts in things. And the series is our chance to have both of those things. It is harder up front, more work up front, getting over this learning curve and becoming the expert in the world. And then the rest of the series is our chance to use our expertise, right? We put in all this effort. Now, when these subtle references are happening 3 books later, because we put in all that effort, we understand this world in a way that we didn't at the beginning. And we kind of are able to scratch 2 different itches by reading sci-fi fantasy series.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you look at the best-selling book in each genre, you'll find that it's the book that has the best world building in it. So when you look at something like Lord of the Rings, there's a reason why it has done so well in fantasy and sold, 250 million copies to the adult readers. And that has to do, I think, with the fact that Tolkien absolutely loved world creation. He created those societies for his various characters, he created their languages and went back 4,000 years and really developed that. And, as a nerd, I remember reading Lord of the Rings when I was a teenager and loving it so much that I read it 6 times in a row, just because I loved it that much. And I kept finding these little Easter eggs all through it, and gaining more and more expertise. And I think that each of us loves that. There's this whole desire to be transported to another world. But I find that if you've got really fascinating characters, it seems to me like a book is too short for a good character. I want more than, just to see a little bit of growth. I want to see them, being morphed and changed in major ways over a period of book after book after book. And so for me, that's the fun of it.
Before you go, hey Kellen, can I send you to get some water? Who on the panel needs water? So, will you go get water? You can just go get them from the vending machine and bring us bottles, okay?
So my thoughts are kind of in line with David's. I feel like as a writer, I can't fully explore a complex character or a complex. Sometimes story ideas come from me as a complex in the form of a complex character. Sometimes it's like a question that I'm kind of like a philosophical question that I can't answer easily, and the series gives you space to work those things out. But I have written like simpler stories. I don't want to say not like in a condescending way, but like it just depends on like the scope of a story, how far your world stretches, how easy it is to wrap up the story, whether you need to have a series or not. For a while in young adult fantasy, a few years ago, there was kind of this trend of like, if you get published, like you have to have a trilogy, like everyone was having a trilogy. Well, do aspiring authors practice trilogies in their spare time? No, we practice book ones over and over again for the most part. So a lot of people were writing trilogies, not really knowing how to write a book 2 or a book 3. And you read a lot of books where it just felt like, especially the second book was like fluff and like a bridge book, and like they didn't know what they were doing. So I feel like on the other hand, like nothing is worse than a series that's unnecessary. Like it's my favorite thing to have a good, like I read Harry Potter over and over again for a decade. I reread Lord of the Rings, not as many times as you did. I even took a philosophy class in college that was based around Lord of the Rings. It was the coolest thing ever. So there's nothing better than a great series and nothing worse than an unnecessary one.
I love series. I mean, if I love the world, and especially the characters, I mean, for me, characters are almost everything. And yes, I like to do world building, and my world building tends to go in my hobby courses, which tend to be economics, law, and politics, which I think get often overlooked in fantasy and science fiction books. But at the heart of it, it's always, for me, about the people, and I tend to fall in love with them, and I want to spend time with them. And I also love to hate my antagonists, my villains, and try to make them feel like the hero of their own story. I mean, the thing I always think about is, it's said that when Dumas killed Porthos in The Man in the Iron Mask.
Spoilers!
Yes, I'm so sorry.
You had a few hundred years to be warned about that one. Too bad.
But at any rate, it's said that Dumas laid down his pen and wept when he killed the character, and that he walked the streets of Paris at night going, "I killed Porthos." And I identify with that in some ways, because I have honestly made myself cry occasionally when I know that something is going to happen to a particular character and I have to put them through it. You know, I think writers have often said, if you don't want people to see your soul, don't write, because you have to pour yourself out onto the page, and that can be, you know, being seen that way can be very terrifying, and I think we're seen through those characters.
The thing is, a story is about something that happens to people, and what they go through, how they change, that sort of thing. But unless you're gaming, unless you kill them, people's lives don't end at the conclusion of an episode in their lives. They may live happily ever after for a while, but no one lives happily ever after. So you can take a character through a lot of different changes in their life without straining it. You know, they're going to be a different person at 18 than they are at 30, and a different person at 60 than they were at 30. Things are going to happen to them in their lives, and it's going to change them. For example, at 18, I was a complete asshole. And afterwards, some people said that I no longer am. You know, that's part of the reason for a series. Also, I think if an invented world is ample enough to tell a good story in, it's ample enough to tell more than one good story. And I mean, after all, the one we live in is not short of materials. No one says, let's wind up the world, all the stories have been told.
I like writing series because the fans enjoy them. I mean, it really doesn't get more involved than that. I mean, the fans come up to me and they say, I love the New Frontier series. I love the adventures of Sir Apropos of Nothing. We do these things for you. And series are popular among fans. Part of it is knowing how far to push a series, because if you push it too far, if you run out of story, or you're doing it just for the sake of fulfilling your contractual obligation, the fans will turn on you. So it's just a matter of knowing how far to push the series, and when you've done everything that can reasonably be done with the series, and have it still be interesting. But Really, I just like doing it for the fans. I like the reactions. I like the fans getting involved in the characters' various adventures, seeing them change over time. The New Frontier series characters have evolved over years. Apropos is still an asshole, but he's had various adventures that have brought him to this particular point in time. A point that I actually hinted at in the first book. And now he's reached that point in the fourth book. I don't know if I'm really going to write any more Apropos novels because I had him go through this character cycle. And I think I may have done everything I want to do with the character. But if I come up with a really good idea for another Apropos book, I will probably write it.
Okay, let's move into a little more craft focused. And Dave, you're gonna spearhead us on this one. So, second books in a series are so hard. They really are. And so I want your best advice for someone who's an aspiring writer or a newer writer who is approaching that second book for the first time, and how do they do it?
Okay, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Our editor for both me and Brandon is Tom Doherty, and in talking about a series and defining what a series is, you know, he talks about the fact that a series should have a persistent world and a persistent character, and I would even say a persistent conflict. In other words, you don't start a series and say, I'm going to tell a story about John, and then in your second book decide I'm going to tell a story about Susan, okay? You will lose a huge number of readers. Just in doing surveys, they found that 32% of men say that they have a difficulty reading about female characters, and so you're going to have a 30% drop-off. That's all it comes down to. And so it becomes pretty difficult if you do that, or if you say, I'm going to set my first story in my science fiction on the planet Tantros, and the second one's going to go to another planet. It just becomes really difficult to hook the reader and to drag them in. So don't go in with the idea that you want to explore and expand and go all over the place typically. I think that that's very dangerous if you try to do it. Can be done. There's no such thing as a hard and fast rule, but you have to watch out for that. The second thing is that I think that when you write a first book in a series, you need to promise the reader that you know how to finish it. And by that, I think what I would like to say is that first book should be pretty self-contained. Okay, if you've got a bunch of conflicts, let's say you've got a big adventure, and you have a romance, and you have a mystery that needs to be solved, you need to close off some things. You say, okay, this adventure is going to get finished. This romance is going to bud. We're not going to solve that mystery in this book, though. You want to leave enough open so that there's something to begin with in that second book.
Okay, so many things I could say about writing a second book, because I was determined that I was going to write the best second book in a trilogy ever the first time I attempted to do so with my debut series. So I thought, I'm going to study everything I can about writing a second book. Spoiler alert, there's hardly anything out there that teaches you how to write a second book. We were taught how to write a first book, and really, at the end of the day, a story is a story and has a good arc and blah, blah, blah. But I did like a big survey on Twitter asking tons of people, what are you looking for in a second book? All the answers were more interesting characters, bigger worlds, bigger conflict, the romance, they just wanted everything bigger. And then what I could find finally is I decided to study the very best second story ever, and for me that's Empire Strikes Back. So I did a really deep dive study on Empire Strikes Back, and I think the best advice I could give you about second stories is to learn about ring plotting. That's how Empire Strikes Back on a lot of Star Wars is written, where it's, instead of like, kind of how we think of like a more linear plot, you start kind of where you end, and a lot of things parallel. So like Luke is hanging upside down in the beginning of Empire Strikes Back. At the end, he's like upside down with his hand chopped off, and there's all sorts of weird, I mean, those are just like physical things, but there's all sorts of really interesting parallels if you look at the plot of Empire Strikes Back as a ring. And just remember that second stories, we lose that page-turning discovery thing. Like in book ones, where it's often the character discovering something new, and that's very exciting. Usually they're more comfortable in their setting, but they don't know everything yet, okay? We're still in the middle of their character arc. I'm thinking of Trilogy here. So make sure your character, they may think that they figured it all out by the end of book one, but they didn't, and they have a lot more to learn. But you're not gonna have the discovery to rely on for tension, and you're not going to have a clean resolution if it's the middle of a series anyway, like in the middle of a trilogy or something else. So you have to rely on more emotional resonance as being your climax in the end.
I approach this as if it's, I approach this as if it's a screenplay in some ways. I mean, in many ways, for me, the second book is Act 2. And Act 2 is always the place where your characters at the end of Act 1 think, you know, they're in the clover, you know, they have it all figured out. And then in the second book, you wreck their lives, or the second act. And so that's usually what I do. I up the tension, I make it bigger by making their problems much worse and taking them through some horrendous situations so that they have to recalibrate everything they thought they knew and everything, you know, they have to make hard choices. And then, you know, in a third book, I mean, but sometimes books get bigger. I mean, I didn't intend for the Imperials, you know, it was funny because when I plotted it with Ty and Daniel, they said it's 6 books, and then when I actually did the outline, I went, no, it's 5 books, which was a little awkward to sort of figure out how these 5 acts went together, but they eventually did. But yeah, that second book needs to, you know, up the stakes and up the tension, and really make things much worse for your characters, in my opinion. I mean, if they're just cruising, then it feels like wasted effort.
Yeah, you've got to be careful about just escalating, though. I mean, you do have to bring in new challenges and torture your characters, which is fun. If you do it too often, you end up like Superman with the different colors of kryptonite. Because, you know, if he's all-powerful, nothing is interesting. So, you know, you've got to invent some new way of bringing him low. Series also give you a chance to switch perspectives on your characters. They can see themselves in different lights. For example, in a long series, I did the Change series that starts with Guys of the Fire. In one trilogy, the children of the, by the way, if you want to continue a series, give them kids. You know, this is a perfect way to screw up someone's life. The children of the rulers go off on a quest, basically. They even have 9 members, and 2 of them are members of a subcult that worship Tolkien's work, and they insist on 9 members. In the trilogy after that, guess what? Their kids do the same thing. And one of the mothers is just going rip shit, and she's sending up guards to like grab them by the ears and drag them back. And she's pacing about it saying, how can they be so irresponsible? You know, they're needed here. And then she stops and thinks, oh my God, I've turned into my mother. You know, and now she sees that her mother had a perfectly reasonable point about the irresponsible thing she was doing. And you know, and it gives you perspective from both sides. On the other hand, their kids are saying, why are you going ripshit? You did exactly the same thing. So it gives an interesting new perspective on the first series by reflecting it back from the a second.
Okay, well, first of all, if your first book ends on a cliffhanger, obviously the first thing you want to do in book 2 is resolve the cliffhanger. And ideally it will lead you to a more interesting way to go. But yeah, a lot of what Melinda said was pretty much right. You need to elevate what's at stake. I mean, you can do it in a number of ways, but the thing that you want to avoid doing is repeating everything that happened in the first film, in the first one. I mean, I'll give you an example. The second SpiderMan movie drove me nuts. I mean, because I did the novelization of that one, and in doing the novelization, I came to the realization that basically all Spider-Man 2 did was hit all the exact same emotional beats that the first movie had. And I thought, my God, this movie is going to tank when people realize that it's just a repetition of the first one. But no, everybody loves Spider-Man 2. I'm going, okay. You know, I guess if you make the story interesting enough, people will ignore the fact that your story kind of fundamentally sucks. But you should try to not have your story suck. You should try and come up with a series of new missions that your hero has to undertake that ideally are going to be much harder for him to accomplish than what was in the first one. You have to raise the stakes. You can have him be with his kids. That's always a possibility. Or you can involve other family members. I mean, that's what they did with the Taken movies. You know, which was basically the same movie all the time, but they started introducing more characters. And then they got taken, because that's what the movie's about. So what you have to do is basically remember everything you did in the first book that made it interesting. And then come up with ways to do the same thing, but have it be sufficiently different that people will embrace it rather than going, oh, I saw this story again. I saw this story the first time. This is the same story over and over again. You know, so you just have to find a way to walk that line, to repeat what you did before, but make it more interesting. Did that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. But you got to clarify, which Spider-Man 2 are you talking about? Dr. Octopus one or the...
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
The first two.
But Dr. Octopus was so interesting, that's why the whole... Anyway. Because I was wondering, well, there have been so many different iterations of Spider-Man. We talk about the Far From Home one or the... I'm actually going to push back a little on the premise of the question, because I think book 2 is the most fun one of all the books to write. Because book 1, you're introducing everything, you're doing your world building, you're setting the wheels in motion, you're turning your characters loose. And then book 3, you've got to wrap everything up and tie up all the loose ends and kill off a bunch of people and happily ever after. But book 2 is when you're on a roll and you're at the open playing field and all hell can break loose and you can do just about anything because you got another whole book to fix it. And it's your Empire Strikes Back. This is when everything's going, the readers they already know who the characters in the world are. They're riding along for the ride and they're not impatient yet. And I've committed trilogies maybe 5 or 6 times, and each time the middle book is my favorite one of all of them.
I was trying to figure this out earlier if you saw me looking at my phone. Do you guys know when this panel ends? Is it 10 till, or is it at the hour, or 5 till? 5 till. 10 till. 10 till. All right, so we got 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Well, somebody came in the back and went,
So
yeah.
On this question, I wanted to just mention, I think that leaning into the structure is a really great way to write a second book. What I mean by that is, if you have a world with 3 mysterious organizations and each book deals with one of them and you can upfront indicate to the reader, and I would disagree a little bit with Dave on the you can't change protagonists and things, if the structure up front, I mean, you see this a lot in YA. The Cinder novels, I believe, did this. If you establish, here is a set of stories we're going to tell, and each book will tackle one of these. You see this a lot in romance series. It's hard to do a series in romance because, you know, they generally end with people hooking up at the end of the book, and you can throw that into chaos. But another way that people do is say, here are 5 sisters, and we're going to write a 5-book series exploring each of their experiences. And so you can lean into the structure. You see me doing this a lot in my series, where I say, all right, 10 orders of knights. This gives you some, as a reader, understanding of how the 10-book series is going to focus. And it's really helpful for me, just always knowing where my launching point is for each book, and things like that. We are going to let there be one question. One question, please. Yes, please address it as a question that can go to the entire panel, not to just one. And we're going to let you start with the ladies, and then we're going to anchor with Dave on this one. Try to go a little fast on this one, because we only have a few minutes left. Oh, can we get the mic in the center on? Or you can just walk up and tell me and I'll tell everybody. Oh, it's on.
It's on? I planned this. My question for all the panelists is, any tips or tricks for balancing multiple main characters and their viewpoints and making it not feel like a weird thing?
Ooh, excellent question.
I'm not sure if I heard.
I understand what she said.
How to balance multiple characters in a story and multiple main characters.
So I had to do this for the first time in my Bone Criers Moon series, where there's 3 main characters. And the only way I could figure out how to do it was a chapter by chapter outline, because I didn't want anybody to have a boring storyline. Two of the characters, they have kind of a romance going on, and so that lends itself to a lot of tension. And then there's a separate character apart from that to make her story interesting, because romance can lots of times steal the scene, especially in young adult. I gave her, she was the one who was on page with the villain of the story, who had to figure out like the biggest mysteries of the book. But I had to do a chapter by chapter outline for my friend to figure out.
Don't get too many characters. Unless you are writing a doorstop like George, do not get too, and even George, I told him we need a tsunami to destroy the Iron Islands. But don't get too many characters, please. And when I plot, when I outline, I assign a different colored pen to each character so that I can see visually if a character is falling out of it. And it may tell me that either I need to come up with more for that character to do, or I don't need that character. So it's really important that you know, and what do they bring to the story? And figure that out first if they're actually going to be useful to you.
Yeah, very much so. I've had at least one book where I suddenly realized, my God, I've got 12 points of view here. So I went back and rewrote it, and it was hard because I was interested in a lot of those characters. But the main characters were sort of off stage for like half the book, and I had to do something to fulfill the what's going on back home stuff. But it just got completely out of hand, and I had to prune it severely. And even so, I got some feedback on that book saying, why not the characters? So that was a lesson to me.
Yeah, I actually did a series I forgot to mention called the Hidden Earth Trilogy. Basically, it involved 10 mythological races taking over the earth and wiping out humanity. And so the first book, I introduced 5 of the races, and they had their various adventures. And then in book 2, I introduced 3 more of the races, and they interacted with characters who survived the first book. And then in the third book, I introduced two more races, plus brought back humanity. So, you know, I just managed to pace out the various races and lay groundwork for each of them. But, you know, wound up telling a single story, which actually ended in cliffhangers now that I think about it.
Well, now I'm realizing that we all have Melinda to thank for George killing off so many characters, because he was clearing the text. Just a quick answer. I like to have bunches of characters, but they're in opposing forces, like 2 different lands or something like that. So effectively, the good guys and the bad guys, but when you do it from their point of view, they all think they're the good guys. And so it gives you this balanced perspective, and explore their personalities and beliefs.
All right, Dave, take us out.
I think that one of the important things to do is remember that you don't always have to tell a story with first-person POVs or deep POV of main characters.
Oh, there's Waldo. Yep.
But you can go ahead and have characters that are that are talking about others, or that are simply observing other major characters and seeing their stories unfold, that way. And so just have fun with that.
Excellent. Thank you guys all for being a wonderful audience.